Professor Mattei, thank you very, very much for being here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hello.
Okay, great, great. Um, we're I'll give you a little information about us, and then I'll introduce you and your book. Um, as you know, the American Monetary Institute is very concerned about monetary reform, and we're broadening our horizons to think more about the effects of capitalism and the suffering that has gone on in the past and how we can change things in that regard. And so we have several speakers. Last night we worked with Michael Hudson, who's worked in the past and the present. You may know him, and soon after your presentation, we'll have Steve Maher and Aquano. So it's and
I know well, yes.
yeah. So we're working on it, and we very much look forward to having you here today. And we're going back a book or so for Professor Mattei, but we've read The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism by Professor Mattei here. I've read your book. I found it fascinating. It's I've gone through like the big myth, and I've been fueled with, we all in the monetary world, we have these understandings, but they're not concrete. And you've made them concrete for us. You've given us a way to think about it more, and it's hitting us. So and we're figuring out how to put together a bigger picture than we thought before. And so Professor Mattei's book covers thoroughly, well, very, very in a deep way, what's going on during and after World War I in terms of austerity. First, there's a good economy, there's higher employment, wage to profits are more on the wage side, and profits are a little bit on the less side for the owners or those who are lending money. And so this goes on into a strong look at England, a strong look at Italy, and thoughts about coming through time up towards the present day. And it's a wonderful, fascinating learning for us. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the very warm welcome. And yes, I've been teaching at the New School for almost 8 years. And I recently, though, moved as associate professor, but I recently moved to the University of Tulsa, Oklahoma, because I'm going to be inaugurating and directing a new center called Center for Heterodox Economics, that will start will be inaugurated in February. So that's me. Great. So I want to start. My own work has used historical political economy as a way to give us conceptual insight on the tendencies of capitalism and the current phase of capitalism. So the idea of actually exploring the past in a way that offers a very clear understanding of dynamics that we just see less today because of their profound normalization. So austerity is a very good case in point. Looking at what happened 100 years ago, really shows clearly how there's nothing technical, of course, and necessary about austerity, but also that there's nothing about austerity that is a mistake. And I think this is very important, that actually historical political economy that uses a class lens allows us also to break away from some naive claims that are made by a lot of Keynesian progressive economists that reduce austerity to irrational politics based on bad theory that doesn't achieve the stated goals of reducing the deficit problem and solving inflation. The point I want to bring about looking at history is that austerity serves a much more profound goal, which is that of securing and protecting the capital order. When I say capital order, I want to just stress what is an intuition that is grounding Marx's critique of political economy, the point that capital as commodity, as money, as GDP growth, as the objective manifestation of wealth, is nothing but the result of capital as a social relation by which the majority of people have no other option but to go work by selling their capacity to work in exchange for a wage. So that the source of value is actually the unpaid labor time of the majority. And this fact that the majority has to accept a condition of subordination in how we produce and distribute goods is not something we should take for granted. And this is what austerity helps preserve, is maintaining the population in a constant state of increased market dependence, meaning that anything we need, from healthcare to school to basic needs, we have to buy, right? And we can buy only if we do go work for our boss. So this relation, which we take for granted, is actually not at all eternal. Advanced capitalism has been on the planet only for 0.1% of the time Homo sapiens has been on the planet. And this non-eternal relationship is often contested very profoundly, thus basically shaking the very foundations of our economy as we know it. So this is the historical moment I investigate in my book, is the immediate aftermath of the First World War, a historical moment in which capitalism was confronting a very serious existential crisis, meaning that the two pillars of our economy, wage relations and private property of the means of production, were no longer taken for granted as natural institutions at the basis of how we organize our production and distribution. And this occurred triggered by the effects of the Great War. I don't want to get into details. I hope you guys have time perhaps to read or listen to. There's also a audiobook version of the book. But I just want to give you a general timeline to focus more on I would like to just focus more on the conceptual findings of this historical case study, again, to show how history can actually illuminate us conceptually about the logic of our economic system. So what happens with the First World War is that the economy is put under great stress because for the first time, the state not only becomes the major producer, breaking with so-called laissez-faire, but it also starts directly engaging in the labor market by basically deciding on the cost of labor, on the distribution of labor, and especially disciplining the workers. And this is not something that is done just bureaucrats don't undertake this evolution in their role in the economy spontaneously. They're forced because they realize that if left to market forces alone, there was not enough production capacity to actually win the war. So we see both in Britain and Italy, which are the two cases I look at, and I'll tell you more about why the comparison in a second. In these two countries, what happens is that there's a strong repoliticization of the economy because workers realize very clearly that it is political decisions that enforce higher rates of exploitation, right? The workers are actually disciplined directly by the state. In Italy, it gets to the point that the state is militarizing the workforce. And this means that the very consensus upon which capitalism usually rests fall. What is the usual, in a way, the invisibility of exploitation in our day-to-day lives comes from the fact that no one is forcing you to go to work, right? It is, though, an impersonal compulsion, because if you don't go to work, you just don't survive. This is very different, of course, from other class societies in which the compulsion to work for someone else and get exploited is very political, very obvious, very explicit. Thus, this impersonality of coercion, what we can call economic compulsion, falls during the war because of the big role of the state in supporting higher rates of exploitation that are needed to win against the enemies. Thus, the explosion in the so-called Red Biennium, 1919-1920, of the immense variety of practical experiments for a post-capitalist society. And what is very interesting to me is that historically, very few historians have actually taken seriously the study of the immediate post-World War I period. What you see is that actually the scholarship in the so-called interwar period and focuses on the 30s, on the Great Depression. And it is very interesting because you see how the very focus of the historian already is a political choice. And by this, I mean that by focusing on the 30s rather than on the 1919, 1920, the political scene is very different. In the 1930s, you can fall in that celebrated belief by which actually capitalism is the democratic middle between, the two extremes of the Soviet Union and fascist Nazi Italy, Germany, right? And that's the celebrated rhetoric that kind of supports the type of violence that capitalism reserves for us. If you look at 1919, the political situation is very different. Capitalism is not the democratic alternative, not even liberal capitalism, because the democratic alternative is represented by efforts to bring about self-management of industry and agriculture at the forefront of how to reorganize production after the Great War. And these experiments are so widespread that it was very interesting to read the bourgeois press. So as a historian, you go and you read the newspapers, and you see that also it's not just the radical militant workers, but even the Times or Il Corriere della Sera, very establishment newspapers, were telling you, yes, the system won't last very much longer. So there was a clear sense that something very different had to come. And I talk about a variety of different situations, from the most radical. My favorite, of course, is the factory council movement that was strong in Britain, but especially strong in Italy, of course, with a lot of influence from the councils in Eastern Europe. We have Antonio Gramsci, who was leading this call for economic democracy based on horizontal assemblies in the workshop that then would build as a federation in the industry, in the city, and with the countryside, with a lot of peasants that were actually occupying land and organizing production through assemblies there as well. So we have the factory council movement in Italy, inspired by the British shop steward movement. And then we have, of course, more reformist proposals, but it was about putting need above profit, something that was really challenging the very core of how our economy functions. We have then the example, for example, of the Sankey Committee in Britain, in which in Parliament there was the discussion and a very concrete possibility of nationalizing coal. and calling workers, though, to participate in production. So it was not just about nationalization from above. It was really about bringing in the workers themselves in deciding for their conditions of labor and the way production was going to be managed. Great. So in all of this existential crisis to which I devote 4 chapters in the book, so there's a lot of detail that we're not talking about here, of course, and it's all archivally based. That's really the privilege of being a scholar, is that being able to actually kind of jump in a different historical moment is incredibly eye-opening. And again, eye-opening because of how much we just take for granted the belief that anything other than capitalism is so utopian. This like really falls when you go in the midst of what was happening in those years. And of course, the wage share had gone up, and as Stephen was pointing out, and the profit share had gone down. Unemployment was very, very low. So clearly a moment in which workers had very high bargaining power, and this allowed them to actually put into practice all of these concrete suggestions. In this situation, of course, there's a reaction, and the reaction is very powerful and very organized. And the reaction, of course, is a process, but there are key moments to understand what happened. And two key moments are the first international financial conferences of Brussels and Genoa that I kind of discovered for the first time in these terms, in the sense that, again, incredibly, historians had completely let's say, ignored the class dimension, the very powerful message, the coding of austerity that happened at these conferences in which explicitly labor representatives were not invited, and those who were invited instead were technicians, were economics professors, brought in for the first time to directly advise all of national governments. So in these assemblies, basically, the austerity motto, consume less, produce more, or better, save hard, live hard. What's the third one? These are actually from the conference, from the proceedings. Live hard, save hard. Now I'm missing one.
Save hard?
And work hard. It's live hard, save hard, work hard. These are like the mottos that are being used to address how to resolve the crisis of the economic system. Let me just read you guys very briefly a quote to give you a sense of the sense that these experts felt encircled. They felt that the foundations of the economy was being really, really questioned. So this is R.H. Brand, who was a British financier, representative of the British delegation. It is a paradox of the situation that, urgent as is this limitation of expenditure on financial and economic grounds, the whole force of public opinion still seems to be exerted in the opposite direction. The war has led to an almost universal demand for the extension of government function. The manual workers were encouraged to expect, and do expect, some new way of life, some greater betterment of their lot. They do not realize the hard truth that a better life can be now reached only through labor and suffering. So labor and suffering becomes really the key of what needs to be enforced once more to rescue the capital order. And again, it seems like I'm being almost provocative and using hyperbolic words, but this is what is fascinating about this story, is that this book is told through the voices of the actors at that time. And the level of sentiment by which the whole society had to be disciplined was very, very strong. I just want to read you a quote from Matteo Pantaleoni. I'll talk about him in a second, who was invited at Brussels as, you know, the founding father of pure economics. Matteo Pantaleoni is one of the most important marginalist economists, who was working with Vilfredo Pareto and really building the new paradigm that is today neoclassical economics, what students and all of us learn when we study economics, the only framework. Well, in this historical moment, actually pure economics was just being refined and diffused. And Maffeo Pantaleoni was not just an academic, he took a big role in running Mussolini's cabinet and was also very preoccupied. And the reason why he took this role is he understood that Mussolini could be very effective in implementing this austerity code. So he writes, thanks to Bolshevism, the modesty and the standard of living that characterized Italians has vanished. It has disappeared in both the working class and the peasantry. It is disgusting to witness the masses of workers that are drunk in all our cities. The notable increase of wages was not accompanied by greater civilization, so that the worker and his spouse lived like pigs in their homes in order to waste the greatest part of their income in wine at the tavern. So this is Maffeo Pantaleoni, who explicitly espoused fascism, but this is his liberal colleague Luigi Einaudi, who then becomes our first president of the Republic after the fall of Mussolini and is one of the most important Italian economists who led also the austerity policies after the Second World War in my country. It is well known that the wages of workers in the industrial and commercial areas of Italy have increased noticeably. The evidence being the conspicuous increase in unnecessary consumption of alcoholic drinks, of sweets, chocolates, and biscuits. So really a sense that people were going far beyond what our economic system could support. So the codification of austerity that was actually defined like a Justinian code, right? They say it's just like a Justinian code. It will reframe the society in Europe and more globally. And what is this austerity code made up? It's a trinity of policies. And this, again, it's how this historical episode helps us illuminate how we should really think about austerity today, right? So first of all, the first element of the trinity is fiscal austerity. And again, fiscal austerity is about cuts in social expenditures, and once more, the possibility of diverting these resources to subsidize private investment. And then, of course, the other side of the coin, which is the state revenue, which is not just about increases in taxes. Tax increases doesn't make any sense as a concept. Again, it's the vision of the whole that economists love, right? You say budget cuts and tax increases, it tells you nothing of who is actually winning and who's losing. It's about regressive taxation, right? And it's very obvious in this historical moment that what they're doing is trying to increase the pool of taxable workers. And this is what Mussolini brags about, having found a whole reserve of newly taxable workers that until then were considered too poor to then contribute to paying taxes. Something that we know very well in the United States is the case, that a lot of employees who are basically working poor pay taxes so that actually their poverty is increased by fiscal extraction from the part of the state, then of course uses it to fund the war effort abroad. So increasing the pool of taxable workers, of course, increases in consumption taxes, especially on working people's consumption, while just a cut and a death of all of those very important progressive measures that had been taken during the Red Biennium. For example, the capital levy, the capital and extra profits that had been made during the war. All of these taxes on capital gains were cut. Inheritance tax was eliminated. And so were the the profit tax and the capital gains tax and the corporate tax, the taxes on businesses. So this is what happens during the war. This is what happens from 1922 onwards, and it happens quite broadly. It's the story I look at is the British story, in which the Treasury and the Bank of England undertake heavy fiscal austerity. Of course, the Geddes Act of 1922 was a much heavier tax in social expenditures than the cuts with Thatcher in the 80s. And of course, Mussolini is also a great student of fiscal austerity. But fiscal austerity doesn't operate alone. It operates also with monetary austerity. And here, I guess, is where, in a way, the study can help also your institute that is focusing on money to actually contextualize, I guess, monetary policy in the broader macroeconomic management role that these economic institutions have. So monetary austerity, of course, is something we know well because it's under our eyes today, or at least until very, very recently. We saw in April of 1920, the Bank of England increased interest rates to 7%. And this is quite strongly triggers a downturn in the economy that, of course, may sound like an attack on the industrial faction of capital. And this is clearly because a lot of the exports in Great Britain were immediately sacrificed because of the revaluation of the pound. But actually, what I want to stress is that these industrial capitalists also won thanks to monetary austerity. Because what you see is that the historical data speaks clearly of how quickly the unemployment rate goes up and how this corresponds to a decrease in unionization. Actually, the data is quite impressive, how fast, the whole data is in chapter 9, how fast actually the union participation drops. And also, of course, how fast the level of the number of workers involved and the number of strikes drop. So the strike intensity really, you see, it has soared in 1919 and then plummets. So the clear measure of the success of austerity is something, again, that I think can speak about our current situation, was its capacity to pacify working class demands, right? To actually kill working class demands. And this is something that at the time was very well noticed by someone like G.D.H. Cole. G.D.H. Cole was a guild socialist. He was a public intellectual working with the guild movement at the time that had won a lot of battles in 1919, 1920. But he is very lucid. He says, the big working class offensive had been successfully stalled off, and British capitalism, though threatened with economic adversity, felt itself once more safely in the saddle and well able to cope, both industrially and politically, with any attempt that might still be made from the labor side to unseat it. I think this quote is crucial because it points to an insight that we should never forget when discussing a capitalist economy. A recession is not necessarily an evil for the stability of class relations. Actually, a recession helps restabilize the class dynamics that are favorable to capital accumulation. So a recession has a short-term cost for a much longer-term gain. The structural gain of actually subordinating and subjugating the working class, who, of course, is disciplined into being substitutable. And this is, of course, something that someone like Michael Kalecki really reminded John Maynard Keynes of in 1942, when he says, yes, sure, we could have a situation of full employment, but we wouldn't be under capitalism. If we had really full employment, why would workers accept their situation as exploited workers who are the source of value in our economy? So very important how these experts understood. And I think this is something that we can clearly see now in the experts leading a lot of the central banks around the world, that there's a clear trade-off, and that ultimately the priority for the efficacious functioning of monetary management is the effect on the labor market, right? So labor relations as the clear subject of interest for monetary experts. And I think this is very important because it's something that, again, we tend to forget when they just tell us that they're increasing interest rate to solve inflation. We see that actually, as my colleague Duncan Foley often says, inflation targeting is actually rate of exploitation targeting. All of those inflation targeting measures are doing something much deeper. They might not solve inflation, especially when inflation is not caused by higher wages, but they do resolve a more fundamental issue for private investors. Okay, so this is monetary austerity. And of course, Britain championed that in the 1920s. And once more, scholarship has been all about, the contrast between the city of London and the manufacturing industry, because they kind of took for granted the consensus of the working class that at that time was really not something to be taken for granted. And finally, we have industrial austerity. And industrial austerity was applied widely both in Britain and Italy. And this was about privatizations, large-scale privatization. Mussolini was actually the first big privatizer in the history of Western capitalism. He privatized insurance companies, he privatized railroad, he privatized many other businesses. And this wave of privatization, of course, was clearly done with the intuition that workers had to face private employees in order to stop thinking they could demand too much. And this intuition, which was clearly in the writings of my economist, is very interesting, always present even today. I want to read you a passage of someone like Alberto Alesina, who is passed recently, a very famous Bocconi, then Harvard economist, who had a very big role in advising. Here it is. A decrease in government employment reduces the probability of finding a job if not employed in the private sector. And a decrease in government wages decreases the worker's income if employed in the public sector. The wage demanded by the union for private sector workers decreases, increasing profits, investment, and competitiveness. So clearly this sense, I actually wanted to read you another one. Can't find the one I want to read, but that one's also was saying the same thing, is the sense that clearly the sense is that privatizing, and if you read actually what Mario Draghi, who now has repackaged himself as a Keynesian of the last hour, if you read what Mario Draghi was talking about when he was in the 1990s pushing for large-scale privatizations, he also was very clear that privatization were efficacious because they were transforming labor relations. So once more, it's not just about selling assets of the state in order to balance the budget. There's also the question of hitting the bargaining power of workers who are no longer public employees. And this is a fundamental element in the conversation that economic experts have. And of course, labor deregulation and ways to defeat the bargaining power of the unions. This was all part of industrial austerity. Mussolini was obviously the champion of this because he eliminated unions politically. He banned strikes and he tortured and beat any workers who were opposing their subordinated condition. So I want to close by just making other 2 points quickly. The first is the comparison of Britain and Italy is particularly illuminating because it again helps, I think outside the usual categories that have entrapped our thinking and thus kind of lend consensus to this absurdly inhumane economic system we live under and perpetuate. This is the dichotomy between fascism and liberalism. If you look historically, what you find out is that fascism is not something different than capitalism. Fascism is capitalism on steroids. Fascism is the best administration suited for capital accumulation. And this is very clearly understood, again, not just by me as a crazy Marxian scholar, by those very experts who are cheering on Benito Mussolini as he came to power. And I have a whole chapter, chapter 8, devoted to the way Benito Mussolini was seen by the British experts at the Bank of England, at the Treasury, and in all of the elite establishment. Also in the United States, by the way. And I'll just read you a quote so that it doesn't seem like I'm making things up. Even Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who expressed wariness of the fact that under fascism, anything in the way of otherness was eliminated and opposition in any form had gone, added in the same breath, the state of affairs is suitable at present and may provide for the moment the administration best adapted for Italy. He continued, fascism has surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment. He writes this in 26 to Jack Morgan Jr. of the House of Morgan, currently the biggest bank in the United States, named JP Morgan Chase. So the level of material and ideological support for fascism was not exceptional in the period I look at. What I try to show is that actually the system itself has in it this tendency towards de-democratization. And this is really important, is that, what you see here is that not only was fascism supported by the liberals were applying the same exact policies as the fascists. So the nuances, and that's what's really interesting, is that what you ultimately see is how the Bank of England and the Treasury and many other sectors of the elites in Britain were actively finding ways to push out democratic participation from macroeconomic management. So in a moment in which the gold standard had vanished, in a moment in which universal suffrage had been gained in Britain, it's really in a moment in which people were demanding a higher level of agency in the type of society that had to come. This was the moment in which the Bank of England as independent institution was pushed the hardest. And so central bank independence is a crucial element of this austerity code. And the British were the ones who then exported this institution to the rest of the globe. Actually, in India, they brought it to Brazil. So you see these very experts that are the protagonists of my book kind of exporting the idea that Ralph Hawtrey says clearly, which is the central bank should never regret, never explain, never regret, never apologize. These are the words: never explain, never regret, never apologize. So they clearly say you can only have prudent finances if you have an independent institution that is able to put the hard suffering first. And this is really the codification of what we kind of take for granted then. And, there's other ways to de-democratize the economy. You could do it, right? There's a spectrum. You can do it the fascist way. And by the way, the book is dedicated to my great uncle, Gianfranco Mattei, who was fighting against the Nazi fascist occupation as a chemist. He was a professor of chemistry making bombs against the fascists, and he was beaten, tortured, to the point that then he had to hang himself with his shoelaces in jail so as to not basically talk against his own comrades. So you can go the fascist way, again, very clear physical violence, or you can do it more subtly through ways to de-democratize the decision-making spaces, right? Central bank independence. You can do it by balancing the budget, putting the balanced budget principle in the Constitution. You can do it by trying to eliminate representational democracy, which is something that is more and more happening in a lot of European countries. So this is, to close, this is one of the other intuitions that emerges from, I would just summarize the three main intuitions. One is, let's stop thinking in the terms market against the state against the market. This is a complete, of course, ideological construction that is meant to hide the fact that without a state actively supporting the pillars of capitalism by shifting all these resources from the many to the few through the austerity trinity that works in unison, we would have no market. There's nothing spontaneous about the market when we realize that the market is based on the subordination and the loss of agency in the production process of the majority. Second intuition, fascism, liberalism, if we look at austerity as the main way to preserve the capital order, we see this alliance is exceedingly strong, and it continues to be strong until this day. And the similarities abound. And third, I think it's very important to notice how, again, fiscal and monetary policies are inseparable from labor relations. And this is something that economists have well in mind. They then conceal it when they speak. But if you look at history, this emerges very, very, very concretely. Yes, so I'll just close here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Mattei. I'm gonna take the privilege to share a few thoughts of I think it's not if, but how we join forces. How do we work together? And from a monetary thinking point of view, we are looking towards spaceship Earth concepts. How to work? How do we create? How do we all live on this planet? And how do we work towards employment, full employment? How we should do new economic systems that aim towards full employment. And one of the things where we might have been able to have helped if we would have been a voice back in 1920 Italy, when things were starting to go wrong, likewise in England, was could be shouting out in the streets that there is money. You can create all the money you want. There doesn't need to be monetary austerity, and that money can be a positive thing that can be created to put people to work. And when you put people to work, it's not inflationary. So I'm thinking of how we can work together to change the system. I came from a union myself. I was in the Chicago Teachers Union, and I've been on strikes, and I've been and it was just great insight on them that they could see a larger connection going on to society, and they worked to really unify with parents and other groups so that the whole system could change. We now have a mayor in Chicago who comes from the Chicago Teachers Union, and they're finding it extremely hard because the austerity economics is right at their door. I'm working to try to connect with them, but I'm wondering, what can we do as monetary thinkers? And we don't get corporate or government funding. We're self-funding, so we're an available think tank to bring together a better future. And yeah, I've enjoyed those stories too of the English visiting Italy and saying, "Oh yeah, this is very good what's going on with Mussolini." And then later on, Mussolini begins to start pulling the strings himself and wanting to have more control going towards the 30s, for example, late in the 20s. But you've described that wonderful stuff in the book. So it was rich material, and you did bring up housing a little bit. There's a wonderful example, like in New Zealand in the 1930s. They decided all of the workers were not just going to get a laborer's house, but good housing. And they thought through a system where everybody could get good housing, and they demanded of their central bank to create the loaning system so that there could be housing for all New Zealanders. And New Zealanders had the highest level of economy in the late 40s and 50s because of the work they did in planning this in the 1930s when they passed their housing bill, and also they had a new view for how to go forward. So in a lot of ways, we're trying to be with the movement to make things better. And just trying to find ways to connect. And it's very hard in this day. It seems it's like the wool, everyone's watching sports or everything else, but we got to wake them up, much like as you would want us to wake up towards what's going on in Gaza. But it's waking up to all of the world and what's going on. There has to be deep change. So I'm going to be quiet for a moment. I gave my 2 cents if you wanted to say something, but we've got a lineup of people behind me too.
Yeah, just very briefly, I do think that this wake up moment has to be seized, and has to be seized in a way that is ideologically, I think, creative and brave in breaking away from the ideal, this false belief by which our capitalism as an economic system can actually work for people. And I think this is really important. So I think the point is that all of these pressures on the capitalist state, now there's the Wage Stabilization Act, there's all these pressures that are happening at all different levels, right? From within parliament to actually, new unions, all of the battles we're seeing need to be, I think, fought with the understanding that what we're doing here is pushing against the logic of our system. Capitalism has austerity in its DNA because of the political need. And again, like technically, sure, we could have all this money, but politically not. Because if you give people living income, people would not accept to be exploited. And this is really important. Why is living income incompatible with the capitalist society? Well, because then you eliminate the economic compulsion that is what is at the basis of value creation in our economy. So if we're fighting from a living income, for example, or for progressive taxation, we are fighting something that is in opposition with the logic and the tendency of our system. So we need to own that. And this is how you can push for principles that are indeed different organizing principles. The logic of need, not the logic of profit. The idea that we can have the logic of profit in a way, we can kind of, package our demands so as to make them compatible with the logic of profit, that has never worked historically, not even during the golden age. And this is actually the book I'm writing now, right now. This is just a falsity. So all of these actions, and we need to go back to looking at these workers who are actually deciding to organize production differently. It's full of examples. Actually, the United States speaks to how strong austerity has been. In the United States, there's very few cases of workers taking on the factory on their own and managing resources on their own. But these are realities around the globe, and they're big in Brazil, for example, right? So even this idea of actually going back to use value, to the material sharing, this is, I think, ultimately what we need to thrive for. So all of the battles that we do from within need to be clearly addressed to the fact that this is a political question. This is a political question about putting humanity before shareholders. And this is something that Gaza is really exploiting. So I hope really, and when you see the students protesting, they know that when they ask for divestment, this is incompatible with what is going on. And it's a political issue. About divesting from the genocide. So I think this is what I would say is we need, I think, a very brave narrative that is able to kind of emancipate us intellectually from the traps we've been in for a long time. And that's kind of how I'm using my history work, and to say, let's just stop thinking in a way that actually helps out maintain illusions about our economy.
Thank you. Thank you. Patrick, I know that you're going to hit a home run now, but I want to get to two more speakers too. So we only got a little bit of time.
Yes, should we collect the questions and then I can just say a couple of thoughts at the end? Should we do that?
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Patrick.
I'm very interested in your teasing out how violence was a key part of putting down labor unrest, and how this became a class project in England after the state went fully into fighting the war economy and produced a collapse in prosperity to collect the war debts. Because you laid that out very, very nicely in the book. And I've heard you speak about that after World War II, where the same phenomena happened again very quickly. And secondly, the whole idea of enabling the owners of these large corporate governance institutions that are really integrated with the British and the Italian state, that then become imperial extractors and exploiters abroad, really, which precipitated the two world wars. How deeply is that baked into your concept of austerity, and how does that link to the free trade regimes that discipline labor and structural adjustment and lifting of capital controls?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Patrick. Yes, I think this is where when you write the book, you realize you should have written many more chapters. It's true. This book, I think the intervention here is to say class matters to understand austerity, but it is a little bit too much focus on the internal class dimension and loses, of course, the general picture of course, the permanent extraction on the south of the globe and the imposition of austerity more broadly. And by the way, of what I think another book does pretty well. It's called The Architects of Austerity, and it talks about the Second World War. I think in that book, and sorry, now I'm blanking on the name. The author doesn't use the same conceptual framework I use. I think he's still kind of stuck in this market versus state a little bit, which is not great for me. But he is very good at showing how international trade and the Bretton Woods system was really the institutional framework that had, as a result, the imposition of domestic austerity. So the connection between international trade and domestic austerity is made very clearly in that book, and that's the part that is missing, but it's very important. And actually, in this, I'm writing a small book for a kind of more trade audience, and I do, of course, have a chapter specifically on the dependency theory and how underdevelopment is the result of development, and of course, austerity has a huge role to play there as well. Even in the Palestine-Israel context, by the way, actually, how that whole dynamic can be understood in this way as center periphery as well.
Thank you, Professor Mattei. Susan, or Sue.
Hi. My question is, Professor, have you read my research paper by the AMI? I got a scholarship in 2019 to research the role of the banks in World War I history.
Okay.
And what I found was, without having a financial system where private commercial banks had the power to create credit, and these banks working with the financiers like JP Morgan were able to not only fund the war for the British government and the French government during the US period of neutrality, but created a booming economy in this country, because Morgan took the bank credits and used them to buy munitions, food, what soldiers need on their backs, whatever. And we wouldn't have had a world war except for this bank credit creation system that was used to fund Britain and France. There would not have been a world war. There had been a war, but not a world war, the first world war in the history of the United States. And this country was booming. Britain and France confiscated gold from their citizens and sent it over to Morgan to pay for this. We had more gold at the end of World War I in this country than any country had ever in the history of the world. And then, of course, when we went to war in 1917, we had the Federal Reserve with their bank credit creation funding what we needed and what France and Britain needed. So I would suggest, I would love to hear your ideas after you read my paper.
Thank you. I'll definitely do that. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I put down the reference that I found on the chat, so I put it in my email.
Sam, are you still there? Sam had his hand up next.
I am. Sure. This is a bit tangential, but it's really present moment. Thank you, first of all, for your work, your book, your presentation, and for AMI for hosting and bringing us together. I heard you talk about opening a heterodox center at Tulsa.
Mhm.
It's so exciting to me. And I just looked up quickly and I saw the job description and they said we're really keen. The economics department at Tulsa is really keen and interested in establishing a long-standing heterodox program. And I'm just curious, two things. One is what
Was
was
I too
motivating?
angry?
Sorry, I'm curious in two things. One,
What motivated the Tulsa Economics Department to become keen and interested in establishing a longstanding thing? And then two is, do you have hope, or where do you get hope in looking at how do we overturn these narratives that are being spun by neoclassical economics every single day?
thank you so much. Very quickly, because I know we're already late on the next talk. You guys have a very intense and great schedule. I get energized by seeing the response, for example, I got from my scholarship. This book has sold a lot of copies, been translated in over 12 languages. It's being translated in over 12 languages. It's reaching people that are not just in academia, and this like really, I think, speaks to the time that is changing. This book 10 years ago, I don't think would have gone anywhere. It would have been buried. It speaks to the fact that people like feel energized and feel revitalized by thoughts that try to really kind of connect things differently. And I see this in the responses I get. And also in this little book I wrote already in Italian, now I'm translated it in English. It's incredible to see people from all walks of life, have nothing to do with academia, who, pick up this book and then write to me, you completely changed the way I look at things. This makes so much sense. And again, it's not me discovering, it's just I'm giving a small contribution in what I think is a collective effort to try to really give us conceptual tools that help the battle rather than absorb conceptual tools that weaken us, this is what has happened. This is the role academics play. The role of academics are as organic intellectuals of the bourgeoisie is actually to obscure what happens rather than explain it. And this is what for Marx was ideology. You hide instead of explain. And this is exactly what the economics profession has done for almost a century now. So I think what the point about the CHE is that we are trying to do something different. It's very interesting to see that it's a private university who is doing this, of course, to instrumentalize the fact that students want to hear new things. So they want to get more tuition money out of attracting students and getting their name out. So they're not doing it out of like a revolutionary concerns. But they have given me the resources, and I think again, playing from within, the fact of just giving space for young minds to find that they can think differently, and there is there is space for them. And they can get recognition is incredible. I was beaten up throughout my PhD. I did my PhD in economics before I studied philosophy. So I came into the discipline. I did a lot of courses and I was just like, what the hell are these guys doing? I could not believe it. Then I got into my history work. Everyone in my school, including my supervisor, thought I was just like, a failed economist, some sort of sociologist, what I was trying to do. And then I got lucky because the new school, Anwar Sheikh, he like kind of found my work and was like, well, this is really important for economics, for economic theory, and economics history is not separable from economic theory. And this is an intuition that itself, I think, is very revolutionary, because economic history is what is able to kind of kill the ideology of this abstract economic theory. So I was lucky in this way, and I'm trying to do my best to kind of, then make use of my luck. But there needs to be more spaces like that. There's too few spaces. Even the new school itself has such little resources for these students. They go hungry when they're doing their PhD. We need more. So we'll see what happens. It's an experiment. It's starting in February. We'll have a great inaugural conference. If you're interested, it's February 6, 7, 8. It's going to be very interesting. I got really good names. I'll hope to maybe circulate it through you guys, and it will be also streamed. So maybe actually I can give the contact. So if you want to email me, mattei@newschool.edu, you guys can all email me, or you can ask again, maybe I can pass the information to Stephen and he can, it would be great to have you at least participate even virtually to our conference, because we'll see if, we can do something, and bit by bit, and you guys are doing your part. So we are all doing our parts. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Professor Mattei. Thank you very, very much. We do need to get on, but we have two more professors coming on, good friends of Professor Mattei here too.
Yes.
And so if it's okay for Professors Maher and Aquano, if we could begin in 8 minutes, so we would begin 5 minutes late if that's okay. We'll begin at 3:15, or well, that's my time, but we'll begin at 1/4 past the hour. And
That sounds good.
and I'll be thank you. And if let's just keep, I'm not going anywhere. If anybody wants to keep the chat going, but if people need a break, use the restroom, etc., fine. If anybody wants to speak up or say something, this is a good time too, or share a thought.
I received a very nice direct message, so I'm gonna just copy it before it disappears.
Good. Oh, by the way, Professor Mattei, I was an archivist too, and I worked with indigenous people looking up historical photographs and bringing them back to their villages so they could write their own history in their own language.
That's wonderful. Very lovely. Very lovely.
Yeah.
So where are you based, Stephen? Where is the whole group based? Is the whole group based specific in a place, or everyone's scattered
No,
around?
we're everywhere. I look through here, I see Canada. Well, it depends what hour it is. Earlier in the morning, like we have Europeans, and we may have like a Filipino, we had an Australian, and then late, and in the evening, like Friday evening, we had an Islamic monetary economic thinker
Mhm.
who
Very
you would
cool.
have appreciated. He wrote this book, Confessions of an Islamic Banker.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah, and so and that's what he talked about, was too much suffering going on in this world, and how are we going to do it different?
Very nice.
Very
Very
much.
lovely. Very
And
lovely. I want to read it. Confessions of an Islamic Banker.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
yeah.
Cool.
So that was Zaid Aziz, and that was he came on after Michael Hudson. And with Michael Hudson,
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed it.
he
Yeah,
did
yeah.
Temples of Enterprise.
This is his new one. When did
Yeah,
this
it came
come
out
out?
in
Okay,
June.
cool.
There's a book review of this on the AMI website if you
Very
want.
cool. I have not read this one yet. I've read Michael Hudson, of course, but not this one. Okay, is it good?
Well, it is, because it's a distillation for the layperson who's not a Middle East scholar, archival scholar from Harvard or Peabody and so it's a whole century of research, from after World War I in the Middle East, where they did all of those works archaeologically, to today, and it's finally, we're getting a nice clean story, and there's an important message for how they had a wonderful, caring society. There was something like a Garden of Eden between 3500 and 2200 BC, where the administrators were actually caring. Labor was precious. And if you lost a husband, you got a job at the palace. Your kids could then go work in the pastures, in the palace pastures. But everybody had a place, and they worked. And he explained then their system of credit. But it was us, the lay people, who the book is geared for.
Very, very cool. Very cool. So I take the opportunity to say that this book, really, I'm going to put it in chat, is the Palestine Laboratory is incredible because of its capacity. As you were pointing out, I think the books that are able to concretely disclose, this book is incredible because it speaks about capitalism at large, right? It takes the fact that, the Israeli army and especially these private businesses, because now the whole arms production in Israel has been quite privatized since the 90s. Speaking of austerity, they did a lot of that. The fact that they tested on the Palestinians is actually something that they can market better, because they say, we've tested all of our technology and it's really incredible how they export this technology of surveillance globally, and of course arms, etc. But it again, it like speaks of this specific country, but it's really exploding what is, a tendency in all countries in our capitalist society, right? This is like the excellence of Israel, but it's an excellence that also the United States has. And so it's a really great book because I think it does speak to our economic system more broadly. And I really think it's mind-blowing. Also, the relation between the Kashmir, the oppression of Kashmir people in India, and how much Modi is supporting the Netanyahu government because of the arms sale and the training that Indian actually police officers get in order to brutalize Muslim people in India. It's really yeah. So I don't know. It's all books that I think help like put everything together.
Yes, yeah, it's in Spanish they would say la vida es una lucha. Life's
Yeah.
a struggle, and lucha means like to wrestle. So life's a wrestling match we got going.
Yeah, and especially when you see how much effort is put into like killing communist threats, that's the other interesting thing. Is like if you really so much money being spent on actually defeating any form of political opposition in a very, very targeted way already speaks to a lot of like why this is really not the spontaneous system, how much effort is being put to target political enemies. So yes, the life is a lucha, but I think there's also space to win because of seeing how worried the establishment is. That is always important.
Well,
Here's
thank you,
Steven. Hi,
Professor
Steve.
Mattei. Okay, yeah, I have some. I'll share a
Hey there.
little bit about my work too, and
Steve Walsh, can I ask one last question? Just as an introduction to Stephen Marr and Scott Aquano's book, I was able to listen extensively to the book that Steve Marr wrote about the integral state, drawing on Gramsci's work, and explain how general dynamics is a model for how the state was integrated with helping corporations meet their needs to expand profits and basically set up rules after World War II. And I wondered if you could just comment on what the heck are we supposed to do about these massive government-like structures called corporations, and think about the role of the state in propping them up. It just seems like we heard from Jonathan McMillan, who works in central banking in Europe, and he said capitalism is corporate capitalism. Can you comment?
Yeah, I think Steve and Scott will do a great job at commenting on that because it's exactly. I think our work is quite complementary in many ways. We look at different aspects of the whole picture, and I think I would leave the floor to them to comment on this.